to start with the acknowledgement of the country. So we like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future, and acknowledge that lands from overseas. Hi, I'm Paul. This will be another friendly ramble with me about the work that we've been doing in the Vision Lab. There are a lot of studies that we've done over the last 12 months, and I'll try and give some big picture highlights from the main findings that we've kind of pursued, all in the vein of confidence and uncertainty in continuous outcome tasks. So, what are continuous outcome tasks? So the obvious ones that we test in the lab are things like orientational gradients and color spectrums and brightness of luminance, but there are many others that are very important, like speed estimation when you're driving, temperature sensing, like heat regulation, pain thresholds, taste and smell strengths, pitch and frequency of sound. These are all continuous domains, best studied not as discrete choices, but as some kind of continuous response spectrum. So what do I mean by discrete and continuous? Well, in a discrete task, you would see a stimulus and then you would push a button to say, yes, it's green. But in a continuous task, you would see a large range of options and you would be able to choose from among them, giving you, a continuous choice spectrum. The nice thing about continuous outcomes is that there's no really wrong answer, just differences in precision or shades of gray. That means we have the perfect testing grounds for questions of confidence and certainty. But it also means we have the perfect conditions to be afflicted by confidence and uncertainty, especially in visual working memory tasks, which is where I reside. So in a visual working memory task, I'm going to use Brian here. He's going to help me explain them. Brian sees a bunch of items, and then we ask Brian to remember them. And so he remembers 1, 2, 3, 4. But at this point, he stops being able to recall them. And most of the literature is focused on what is the cause of this limitation. And today, I don't really care. It's where the literature focuses, but it's not the focus of this talk. Just know that there is a capacity limitation around this 4-item limit. And it's why most of the studies focus on items that go from 1 to 4 or 1 to 6, because that's where the interesting stuff happens. Okay, so in a recall task, Brian sees these 3 items. We probe him for one of them, and he makes a response with a mouse or maybe his eyes, if we do eye tracking. Now, in this case, Brian has recalled a blue item, but in fact, it was pink. And what we can do in a continuous outcome task is measure this difference in terms of precision, and that gives us our kind of accuracy measure. And we can also take the response time for Brian to make his choice. And so this gives us our 2 main metrics, precision and response time. So now that we've covered the basics of what I do, let's get into the studies. So study 1 is the affliction of item uncertainty, or what Philip lovingly refers to as the cursed experiments. So this was an eye tracking task. We did a smaller end design, so we had 5 participants do 10 sessions each. What they saw were a color array like this, where they saw some items, they were probed on one of them in the very thick white border, and then they had to move their eye to the color spectrum and fixate on what color they thought it was. Some people, so one group, did item arrays of size 1, 2, 3, and 4, and a separate group did arrays of 1, 2, 4, and 6. 3 people did both. Now, what we expected to see for precision, so this is angular error, where 0 is spoil on the money, you've got the right color, and negative is a counterclockwise inflection, and positive is a clockwise inflection, right? We expect to see that people would be very precise for one item, and they would decrease in their precision as item arrays increase. What we also expect is that response times would get slower as item arrays increase. What we didn't expect were these double bumps. And we definitely didn't expect to see this in every single item set. and for every single participant.
Is that the curse?
That's the curse. So the curse is that some people, most of the time, actually all people most of the time, would see the color, they'd respond by looking at the spectrum, and they would push a button, and then that would terminate their decision. However, if your eye isn't fixated stably enough, then the decision doesn't terminate, and you have to push the button again. And sometimes you have to push the button multiple times, and we've got like some response times of like a minute because someone's just, getting angry. So then the decision terminates, and you get this waylaid second button. Don't do eye tracking. That was the conclusion of that study. But it's not all for loss. This was done with an older eye tracker that sits on your head. New ones you can set up, on the desk in front of you. So maybe newer eye trackers wouldn't have this problem. Point is, we were able to go through the data and reconstruct. Instead of looking at what the eye tracker said, we took a frame-by-frame analysis of where the eye was, and then matched it up with the first button press and recovered all the data. I'm going to focus on just one participant. This is a small design, because the results generalize, and this is more intuitive. So here we have the small range on the left and the large range on the right. This person did both, and the set size is 1 to 4, and then 1 to 6 for the large range. Focusing down, what we see in the small range is that precision is very tight for one item, as you would expect, but in the large range, precision is wider. That is, people are less precise. This is for one item in both cases. Also, we see that the response times are slower in the large range. Again, for one item. There's nothing different here about the stimulus. The two items, we see the exact same thing. Precision is wider in the larger set. Response times are slower. If we go to the 4-item condition, which was in both cases, again, precision is wider in the large range and response times are slower. And 3 and 6, of course, fit somewhere in between all this. So our speculative conclusions from this study are that larger arrays are hard to remember. The largest array size affects encoding of smaller array sizes. Encoding and retrieval require episode binding to the display context. That is, the location and the color have to be bound when you encode them. That's not controversial. What's interesting is that the larger range displays leads to more unencoded or unbound items. That's the speculation. And so we think that these unbound items may interfere more on subsequent trials than their bound counterparts. And because of that, in a mixed trial design where these are interleaved, larger array sizes would decrease recall precision for smaller item sets. So 6 would influence the processing of 1, 2, and 4 more than 4 would in the small item range group. So unbound items may be a source of memory uncertainty. What happens when we query these items? That brings us to study 2. If you fail to retrieve, try again. Here, we moved away from eye tracking and into the world of JavaScript, which is a fresh hell. But I was able to program all of this and write it online. So we did 9 trials per set size with 41 people, and we retained 31. What they did is they viewed an item set of 1, 2, 4, or 6 items. Then they were presented a color wheel, and they had to move their mouse and respond where they thought the color was. When they made their choice, we looked at the difference between their choice and where the cued color was. That gave us an angular error. And then we took the negative of this as well. And this gave us the cued color and an alternate color, which was the same angular error away from their response. And then we formed a second choice, which is a binary choice, a recognition color task, where they were presented the true color, the cued color, and an alternate color. And they had to choose the correct one. Of course, because of this, the more precise you are in hitting the cued color, the more difficult this becomes. So it basically becomes an adaptive difficulty task in the second recognition phase. So in doing this, we have to define what is a guess? We don't really have wrong and right answers. This is continuous, so we have to figure out a nice way of doing this. So what we did is we did a mixture model. One part is a von Mises distribution, which has a kappa, which defines the precision. Larger kappas are more precise. Yep. And it has a guessing component. And this describes, a uniform distribution. We think of everything within the von Mises distribution, this normal distribution basically wrapped around a circle, as being in memory, and everything outside of it as being a guess. And that's how we kind of come up with this idea of guessing. To fit this, we fit a single von Mises across array sizes with a varying level of guessing. This is just a choice that I made. There are lots of arguments about how you can do this, but this is what I went with. So here you can see that the von Mises component is fixed, but the guessing component is increasing across the array sizes. And for cleaning purposes, I said that anything where guessing was more than 5% for an array size of 1, the person wasn't doing the task, and anything more than 50% from the array size of 2, they weren't doing the task. What I meant was I could go through and clean our data for people who just weren't doing the task properly, and that's how I got from 41 people down to 31. So, focusing on the second part of this task, this is the recall aspect. What we can do is separate their accuracy at getting the true color by whether it was an in-memory process in dark on the left or a guess response here shaded in transparent. What we can see for guesses is that people are far above 50% accuracy, the dotted line. So people are far more likely to get the true color, even when their first choice was a complete guess. So I would say you can retrieve information that was poorly bound. What's also interesting, aside from the fact that this decreases with set size, and that makes sense, is that there is a constant level of error for items that were in memory. So they definitely got it right, but there is pretty much the same degree of error across all these items. And that comes down to the adaptive task difficulty. So what you can see here in this one item set, the accuracy across the possible range of responses, is that when they're very accurate, they have pretty much a guessing-like behavior. And that's because the task is too difficult in that range. The colors are basically identical. What's interesting though is that in this range, response times are stable. So what I've done for the purpose of modeling is treat those responses within those white dotted lines as basically accurate, because the differences we're seeing here is purely because they're guessing between two colors that look identical, has nothing to do with their memory process. So, interim conclusions. If you fail to retrieve, try again. Memory for non-retrieved items does persist. It may reflect binding errors like swap errors that we correct as part of a post-decisional process. Alternatively, item recall and item recognition may reflect different processes with different levels of precision. Now, I really don't like that explanation. So here's where the RT modeling can help. Now, in continuous RT modeling, there's a few ways of doing it, but I choose to use the easy diffusion model because, well, it's easy. The idea is that you have some kind of a hitting point on a circle. You can represent this by a drift rate, which is the quality of information. You can also describe the outer side of the circle as the boundary separation, or the quantity of information that you need to reach. And you have some kind of non-decision time, the time outside of the decision process. Now, the easy model sacrifices parameters for easy mean-based analytic solutions, so it's incredibly fast, as opposed to the full circular diffusion model, which requires a lot of trials and is quite slow to fit. But because we're using means, we lose some of the nuance in drift standard deviation and trial-to-trial variability. So there are downsides to this, but I think for today it will suit. When it comes to two choice tasks, so this is like our second recognition phase, I chose to use the easy diffusion decision model. So here you can have two choices. They have the same boundary separation, one positive, one negative, choice A, choice B. Let's just focus on choice A for simplicity. You can have the same decision process, going to a hitting point, a drift rate, a non-decision time, and a total RT. So these are giving you the same aspects, but one for a two-choice task and one for a continuous task. Okay. So what did I do? I fit the easy circular diffusion model to our first recall task, and I fit the easy binary two-choice model to our binary task. And I looked at how well the parameters correlate. And as you can see here, the parameters correlate very well. That is, as boundary separation increases for memory recall, it increases for memory recognition. These are very strong correlations and quite significant. I also looked at this for the drift rate. Yeah, Chris, jump in.
Hey, sorry, I just have a quick one, and it's mainly just so I don't spend the rest of the talk confused. So, you know, when you fit easy diffusion, does it not, like, is the reason that people are confusing like colors, can part of that be captured by trial to trial variability? Like they're just a bit shit with the color task. And so does trial to trial variability could it also capture that? Like, does not fitting it mean that it's captured in some other way? Is that a dumb question? Sorry.
There are lots of aspects that a full diffusion and a full circular diffusion model would capture that you can't do with easy.
Yeah. Does it not matter in this case though? Because the color thing is not a big deal.
I mean, it could matter. So things like standard deviation of the drift could be an explanation in the sense that a very, very variable model might reach an earlier conclusion simply because the drift rate's just wildly changing, right? Mm-hmm. And now if that's the case, you could have a drift effect and a standard deviation effect and a fixed boundary, and you would get the same results.
Okay. Right. And so the main focus here is on the item number.
Yes.
More than anything else. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep. But you're totally right. And that's why a lot of the work that we're doing, we're basically replicating with small n designs so that we can fit the full CDM to it and double check. But yeah, these are the interim results. All right, so back to this. No, thanks for interrupting, Chris. So we have our drift rates as well. This is the quality of information. Once again, we see that the quality of information in the item recall and recognition phase are strongly correlated, except for item 1. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. One item is a special case. You can kind of make a choice before you get cued to make a choice, so it could be something in there. Regardless, it does seem like if you fail to retrieve, you should try again, and that the latent cognitive parameters, drift rate and boundary, do correlate across these recall and recognition tasks between the continuous and the discrete easy models. And it's very notable that this all works in an adaptive difficulty design, given that that's quite a difficult kind of setup to try and model. All of this led me to this next question, right? Could post-decisional processing, these corrections that we seem to be able to make, be thought of in another fashion, as maybe post-decisional confidence? And that brought me to the arc of the confidence. So confidence literature often asks people, in the post-decisional process to rate their confidence on some kind of Likert scale, right? Like certainly correct, certainly wrong, or some use a continuous scale where they just give 2 anchors and they get them to move a slider. These are useful, but they are very loosely tied to the initial decision. And from a modeling standpoint, that can be problematic. They use a different stimulus to what you responded to. They use different response formats to how you responded in the first place. and they have different biases like middling and anchor effects. So I figure we need a better mousetrap. So in this task, people saw their colors, they responded with their mouse, and then as soon as they made a response, an arc began to be drawn, and that was generated by their mouse movement. What happened is they could draw an arc to represent how confident they were about their color choice. The nice issue of the arc is that they received points, but they only received points if their arc captured the true color. So they were incentivized, to actually use the arc properly. And the points were a product of two things: how close their initial choice was and how small their arc was. So if you were very accurate and drew a very small arc, you would get the most points. So this all incentivized people to use this arc appropriately. They also got feedback in between every trial, and so they could see how they were going, and people really seem to love this. So it's become a staple of my experimental design. Now, the questions in this area is recall confidence related to error precision? And do decision model parameters for either recall and recall confidence correlate? And do these parameters describe confidence as a decision criteria or a drift rate effect? So the first question to address, does response error correlate with the arc length? And yes, very, very much so. The better you are at responding to the color, the more confident you are. So the arc length is smaller. That makes a lot of sense, and it holds up across array sizes. Not only that, but we see that response time to draw your arc is also correlated with your response time to respond in the first place, right? So RT does have some kind of relationship here as well. So what I did is fit the easy circular diffusion model to both their initial choice, as I did in the previous task, but also to their arc. So to define these two things, I took the arc precision as the closest point of the arc tip to the true color. So that gave me my measure of error. And the response time was the time to draw the arc itself, okay? So that gave me my two metrics that I needed in this case. Jason's giving me these chin thoughts, so
No, don't let me keep going.
No, there's problems in it, but yeah. So when you do this, you can look at the boundary separations and again, the drift rates. Here we see incredibly strong associations. You would not expect to see these level of correlations, I think, in a regular confidence and certainty task. So I would argue that not only is response time and arc length the correlates of confidence or certainty, but that the latent parameters do map on to your initial decision. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So my conclusions from this is that recall confidence or arc length is directly related to error precision, that decision model parameters for either recall and recall confidence correlate, indicating the same latent parameters governing both behaviors. But it does raise a difficult question, and that is arc length the same as confidence? Or is it more like decision certainty? Now, think of it this way. Certainty is like, I am certain that I got the right color. And the way that we operationalize that point system, it kind of feels more like that people might overcompensate to make sure that they're certain that they covered the point. And confidence, maybe that's an elusive other kind of dimension that we're not quite capturing. So I'm not sure. And that's what brought me to study for when I began relating to this topic. So in study 4, this is ongoing work. I think I programmed it last week or the week before. We show people some colors, then they get cued and they make their response. One of the response formats allows them to respond with a slider. So as soon as they respond, they have to move down to the slider where the little circle is, which randomly appears somewhere along the slider, so we don't get kind of starting slider effects. The slider then activates and they can move their mouse to respond, whether they were not confident or very confident. And they get points based on how close they were. The design format is this. Everybody, for half of their experiment, does the arc task. One group then also does a slider with a certainty scale, which goes from certainly wrong to unsure in the middle to certainly right. One group does a confidence slider, which goes from no confidence to very confident. And the question is, how well does the arc relate to these two sliders? And is this a way of maybe getting to the underlying question of what is it indexing? Now, I've done this experiment myself. I was going to show those results, but they are weird, probably because I have done in the region of 15,000 trials of this task. I am way over practiced, so I don't really trust my confidence and certainty ratings. So the plan is to run this through Sonar with 40 people in each group and just see what the results show. The other things that I promised in the abstract that I realized that I have to talk about is a future study 5, and that's on confidence in the third dimension, also known as I really should stop. So this is the task I'm most fascinated with. We've talked about the easy circular diffusion model, where we have this two-dimensional response format. But you can also think about this as a three-dimensional model or a spherical model. And this is where we're going to go in the future. So here we have an x-axis, a y-axis, just like you would with a circle, but we also have a z-plane. Now, when someone makes a response in this kind of a model, they can hit anywhere on the inside of the circle. And the way you can map this into a diffusion process is that you can run down the outside of the circle to the two-dimensional plane. And then you can fit your circular diffusion model to that data. The question becomes, what about the third dimension? Well, that becomes a measure of something else. And in theory, we think it's uncertainty or maybe confidence or entropy or something. It's very elusive because we haven't tested it yet. But in theory, we think it maps onto something of that process. And it's very interesting because it's measuring uncertainty as part of the decision process rather than after the decision has been made. So I'm very curious about what we can find in this new modeling format. And my plan is to look at this with the small n arc task. So that's the future plan. And study 6 is how is there still more? This is work that I wanted to end on if I had time. Oh, okay, it's not. Wow. Okay, so study 6 is work by Alan Lane. It's a really interesting task. So here we have the exact same format that we've done previously. We have colors, we have color patches, people make a response. What's important here is that half of the trials are, I would call it desaturated, but the proper terminology is they have a decreased luminance, right? So all the colors are isoluminant to each other, but half of the patches are less luminant, less bright. And what's important is that the color wheel itself is identical. So the color wheel is always fully saturated. And what it does is introduce this notion that the desaturated colors people have to not only look at, but then think about what that would look like in a fully saturated format before they make their choice. I literally finished collecting this data, I think, last week on Thursday, so I just had a very quick look before the talk. What we're seeing already is, this is a small n design, so this is my data, that boundary separation in pink decreases in the low saturation group. That drift rate also decreases in the low saturation group. Thanks. And it has the same effects that you would expect across item sizes where it also decreases. Now, this seems relatively obvious. You know, it's hard to make choices when things are less saturated, of course, but it's actually quite important. Most of the literature is focused on making stimulus displays shorter to make it more difficult and affect encoding, or to put masks over stimulus or noise over stimulus to make them harder to see. In this case, we do none of that. We show the stimuli for 1.5 seconds. They have plenty of time to encode it. The only thing that's varied here is how difficult it is for them to, reproduce the color. And the difference here is that we see very clear boundary effects, which you don't normally see if you use quick response times. It's all in the drift rate. And as Dan F and I were talking about earlier, I am leaning more and more towards investigating memory for these item sets that are longer than, say, 450 milliseconds, which is a pretty standard display time in literature. So more and more towards longer display times when people have enough time to encode all the items and form memories, and then we can investigate the memory processes therein and compare them to how they perform when they have these really, really harsh time deadlines. My thought is that these memory processes that we see at fast deadlines should hold up. And if they don't, then it's probably all in the encoding and not necessarily in the memory. And let's face it, it's kind of weird because most of the literature is focused on the memory. So that's where I stand on this. That's why I think this is really cool and interesting. And that's where I end. So thank you to all my wonderful collaborators. I think we've got heaps of time. I really blew through that. Yes, Chris. I pick you. You have lots of questions.
Yeah, but does anyone else want to go first on the table?
Is that
All right. No. So I can talk.
Yes, you can.
Okay, cool. Well, Philip isn't here, so he's not here to stop me. I just have like a quick question. So first of all, well done on addressing confidence in memory, which is a dirty topic that like very few people are willing to touch because it's really hard. And I guess if we go back to the question of confidence and certainty, because I know Danny F and I have had like many sort of random corridor coffee run-in discussions about this, and I'm kind of keen to hear your thoughts. So two kind of questions, which are sort of the side of the same thing. I guess my question is like, why do you think confidence and certainty are different from each other? Because in my mind, I actually don't think they are, but I'm like willing to be convinced that they could be, and I've kind of thought about it the wrong way. So I want you to elaborate on that a bit more with kind of sufficient depth, and then we can go from there.
Okay, great question.
Yeah.
I started off thinking that they were the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not convinced that they're not.
Yeah.
In all honesty, the reason why I started even pondering whether they weren't was also Dan.
I'm the problem.
Where I was doing these art tasks and I was showing Dan, and we were talking about whether this was confidence, and Dan said, well, what if it isn't? And I got into that same stage of trying to define what confidence is and what certainty is,
Mm-hmm.
and realizing I don't have a good answer.
Yeah.
having done the slider task for myself, there does seem to feel like a difference in the way that you treat the scales.
Sure. Yeah. Is that because you're just asking different questions and you call them different things? Because, for example, I could call it both confidence scales, and I'd say one is a continuous readout and the other one is a discrete readout. And arguably, people can represent uncertainty in their brain and they read it out as a confidence rating. Now, that doesn't mean they're different things. It means one is a noisy readout of the other. So I'm going to take that and then throw it back at you and then say, okay, so do you still think they're different things?
So this is the cool thing. So
Yeah.
I think that's why that third dimension of the spherical model. I'm able to ever call that certainty or confidence and more like kind of this latent entropy, right?
Yeah. How's
Because,
that not the same thing as confidence though?
because I think that, as you're saying, there might be a latent representation of noisiness
Yeah.
that we are vaguely aware of,
Uh-huh.
that we apply these labels of confidence and uncertainty to.
Yeah.
And your version of confidence is slightly different to my version of confidence, and the same with certainty. And I think that we're going to see some very weird results when we test this stuff across participants, where we'll probably get like two groups where some people treat confidence one way and some people treat it another way, right?
Uh-huh. Okay.
And I think that's the labeling issue of it.
Yeah. Okay.
From the underlying latent kind of entropy of how uncertain you feel about it, right?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
So I think from a modeling standpoint, I hope that we might be able to model the latent stuff.
Uh-huh.
Raw data, maybe see some of the weird differences emerging.
Sure. Okay. That kind of makes sense. I guess I'll leave you with this and we can chat offline later. If you look in like all of the recent literature and all of the crap from the 60s as well, because people just redo stuff and publish it in Neuron. I think like entropy, confidence, certainty, people just name it different ways to get it kind of sold in different ways. But I would argue they're very similar to each other. And I'm starting to think that I'm not sure how much it matters, but I think the thing that you've touched on that does matter, which is like the takeaway, is that what matters is why people give different confidence ratings once you've sufficiently calibrated them to do so, right? So like the meat here is actually why people's confidence, why they give different confidence ratings to each other that are not related to their subjective accuracy or their objective accuracy on a task. And I think there's a paper that I'll send you and I think worth thinking about, which is that a lot of confidence or uncertainty or entropy is associated with how correct you think you are and how closely that corresponds to, your accuracy. But a lot of, part of that is not. And I think in order to be able to capture people's behavior well, you have to figure out the part that's not, because it's not what is confidence, it's what is not confidence, I think, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think if you can find a way to get people to give really good confidence ratings, which I think your reward task will do, because everyone loves some friggin' points, don't they? Yeah, I think you can kind of get close to that, but I think you might have to try and figure out what what the individual difference aspect of your task is. And I'm not sure, I don't agree that there's going to be two. I think it's going to be a real shit show, but I think it's very exciting. So yeah.
I have no good indication of what it will be.
Yeah, it always is, but I think it'll be a very exciting set of results to kind of analyze. So yeah, the reward task seems like a good way to go, provided you don't end up in a meta confidence state, which is yeah. So, and that could be a concern. I don't know. I think I'm not really into the meta confidence. Other people will have way more expertise on that. But yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thanks, Chris. Just looking at the chat, I see Kevin.
Could I add a small point onto that?
Before you do, just that, Kevin, I don't know about whether confidence and uncertainty very monotonically, but I'll have to look at that in the scans. And then
thanks, great talk.
Oh, cheers, Kev.
Yeah, also great talk. But my I guess speaking to Chris's point and to your point, I think this is the really tricky bit though, right? Where I think some people have laid out confidence and certainty in a way that theoretically they can be dissociated. So for example, you can be highly certain that you're wrong. And if you think of confidence as like a subjective probability that you're right, then you can have like low confidence and high certainty. And maybe you can sort of see this maybe in like a 3-choice task where you can think of like, well, I knew that the one that I got was wrong, but I don't know like which one is correct. So you can be not confident, but then like not certain, like, if that, but yeah, I sort of agree that maybe a lot of the confusion here all comes to how it's measured and like, oh yeah, what we're really looking at, like Chris said, is sort of like how do people give these responses, but I feel like we're still looking for the right language to use in terms of the ARC task. Like it doesn't neatly fit. And I guess in the cases that we're looking at, like confidence and certainty are, speaking to Kevin's point, like monotonically related within that range sort of thing. And, you know, we might not be exploring that range where they're not, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of theoretical confusion or like maybe in terms of like How-Min's work, for example, where this is restricted in a way that like it's really meaningful, or, you know, like looking at these specific things. Yeah, I feel like we're getting closer to like tightly linking these things, right, in the context of our task.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully. On Chris's and your point, Chris's point about finding out what isn't certainty and what isn't confidence, I think there is something we can do in this space that's actually useful. I mentioned in the early tasks about unbound items in memory and how they might be something like swap errors, but I didn't quite go into what that is. And Jason is getting PTSD. Sorry, Jason. So swap error is where you have, say, the location, you have location and color information for all the stimuli, but you've accidentally swapped the color information with one of the other locations. So you think that you have the right answer, but in fact you have the wrong one because you've swapped. You can get that from a modeling standpoint by looking at the likelihood of responding to that color, given that it was present on the screen or given that it was just a random choice. So you can recover that information. And once you parcel out what is a swap error and what isn't a swap error, you could also look at the confidence and certainty ratings for those items. So you would expect if someone made a swap error, that they'll be very certain about it, but they'd be very wrong. And so we might have the ability to start looking at things where we think people think that they're doing the right thing, but they're getting it wrong, as well as we have the ability to look at guessing behaviors, as I showed with the mixture model, to see what's a guess from the response format and how that relates to certainty and confidence. And then, of course, just the normal blasé, something's in memory, how people respond. I'll give you that the uncertainty you're talking about could also be a probability distribution representation over all of your options, but your confidence is about a specific response. Yep. But I think you can have confidence about both. So I'm still not convinced they are different, but I'm also keen for a PBS science paper that fleshes through that.
Yeah, still not convinced, but like if you fleshed it out in the like 10-page behavioral brain sciences, that'd be kind of thrilling. So I'm willing to hash it out.
No worries.
Well, I'd like to add something to that, but I think there was a question from Anthony. I don't want to.
Yeah, so Anthony says, apologies for the question, but is there a mathematical basis for confidence unless it's borrowed from entropy? I was just wondering, by that I mean referring to a formula. I mean, there probably is in the literature, but none that I'm aware of that neatly fit within what we're doing. Yeah, there might be for like 2-choice tasks that exists, but not from what I think I know of. Yeah, cheers, Anthony.
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts I'm struggling to organize. So, you know, if it doesn't make sense, we can talk about it outside. I think, yeah, like obviously I'm obsessed with swap errors and intrusion, so that's kind of like going to be what I talk about. But yeah, I think in my mind, that's the big missing part in all this.
Yes.
I will say that your description of the swap error is how Paul Bayes thinks about it. there's the alternative, which is, I think Michael Pratt is, I can send you the paper if you want, where it's not that you like unaware, like respond with another color in an unaware fashion. He describes another account, which is sort of swap errors as a strategic guess. Like I don't know about the item, I don't know what item you're asking about, but I've got all this information, unbound information. I'll give you one of them, right? Because they're a better response than something in the empty space. I remember a discussion Dan Hutchinson and I had, I don't know if you were part of it, so I'll just kind of recap it and jump in if I've misrepresented your idea. But like, if we think about the ARC task, let's imagine a case where I've done in a sort of Prattian way, like I know all the items, but I don't know which one I'm being asked about. If you're telling me I'm wrong, I'm drawing an arc, then I know where all the other colors were, and I want my arc to cover them. So there's a space between what I've given you and where I want to go to that I actually don't think is in, but the arc has to move across that space to cover the spot that I want to give you. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I was excited to see that you had that alternative format, which is to have the scale, right? Because that kind of gets around that. It's like, you know, I want to give you something that's not what I gave you the first time, without having to go through that blank space. Yeah, so yeah, I'd be interested to see the results from that and how the two compare. Because yeah, it's never quite sat well with me, like the idea of like what the arc represents. Like there's still, you know, always that's the big question, what is the arc measuring? But yeah, I wondered if you have anything to say about that, Grant.
Only in the sense that I think we could test those two competing ideas. So in the Pratt style, we know the angular location on the color wheel of all the alternative items. And if people are using the arc to try and cover as many points as they can, right? Specifically for swap errors or intrusions, then we can look and see whether they are hedging the bets. Alternatively, if they're not hedging their bets, that would fall more towards the base style of you're very confident because you think you're right. And that's actually really interesting. We totally look at that. We should look at that. What are you doing later? Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, it's possible that both things happen, you know, like it's not mutually exclusive. It's just like, I think a lot of this, in a lot of literature on swap errors is kind of like Bayesian, but I think there's something to the sort of, yeah, like people doing weird stuff that you don't expect.
Yeah, I haven't touched on this in all this topic. There are some people who do really weird things in this task, especially in the recall recognition task. There's someone who almost guessed all of their initial responses and then had like great accuracy in the recognition phase. So they were doing the task, they're just doing it really weirdly. And it's clear that they kind of understood it. They just did it in their own fashion. There's also a few people who are colorblind who have done the task.
Oh, well.
And I've got that information, but their response patterns are really good. Like they do the task really well. But it also raises interesting questions about, is that similar to look at swap errors?
I was like, they probably have different swap errors.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And that's fascinating. You're just like, cool, we can look at this.
Oh, please, sorry, ask one more question, then you go back. So I was wondering actually, so in the Footnote task, there's this above chance, and you know, talked about this a fair bit as well. I do wonder if there's anything analogous you might see in the ARC task where if people kind of figure out that they've made a mistake and they sort of know what the correct answer is, that the edge of that arc might cluster or be fairly precise or more precise than you would expect if they were guessing to the correct response sort of thing. So it might be anchored to the swap or to, like in a subset, you might just see a little bump in the distribution. I'm not sure. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. With the confidence, what I'm struggling with understanding with the circular diffusion model is this the high dimensional circular diffusion model seems like a great formalism for confidence,
Yes.
but how do you plan on implementing it to capture confidence? Like, this is what I'm kind of struggling to understand here.
Yes.
Like what, like it strikes me that you can have, like, for instance, information that's strongly correlated there with the strength of evidence in the main task, but you can also have it in a way that's totally uncorrelated and function almost like a timer. So
Yeah.
Haman's doing some work where she has these kind of uncorrelated accumulators that just basically index a subjective degree of time that has elapsed. And you could do something very similar with that as well.
Yeah. And then there's also, I forget who the authors are, the one with the noise,
Yeah.
visual noise
The moment at all,
accumulation.
yeah.
Yeah. So totally, there are different ways of capturing that. I dare say what's kind of happening in both cases is they're both indexing that kind of, build up of kind of uncertain information, right? And you can totally get away with doing it like after the fact, kind of erasing it accumulator, or you could try and build it into the model. I think that's what that third dimension is basically doing. It's just in the sense of this a more elegant way of building all into the same process. That being said, I don't know, because we've never actually fit real data with this thing. Specifically, we never fit data that we know anything about the confidence kind of ratings. We have lots of data that can fit a 3D model too, but it doesn't tell us anything about what that third dimension actually means.
Right.
So this is trying to address that fundamental question.
Right.
And if it doesn't work, then I don't know what it is.
Yeah. The other question I have was having to do with experiment 1. You mentioned that you could have these kind of interference from prior trials. Have you thought about actually, I mean, that seems like something that's testable with that data, right?
Yes.
Which is you can look at whether or not intrusions actually occur from prior trials and using some of these intrusion analyses.
Yeah. And there's work that's done some of this that treats it as like an exponential decay in the past.
Sure.
I read that like 8 months ago. I think that's where we'll probably end up going. We haven't made a full plan of how to tackle this from a paper standpoint yet. My main thing has just been collecting all this data before I have to go on for a
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
But yeah, it's totally something that we can look at from a modeling standpoint. And I think we should. It totally makes sense, and it fits nicely into this whole vein of like intrusion.
One other thing really quick I wanted to add was the 2AFC data you had. Tim Brady did something extremely similar where I don't know if they published it, but I saw a presentation at Psychonomics where they also found, well above chance accuracy for responses that looked just like guesses. Now, of course, they I think were using it to knock down the slot model and things like that.
Yes.
But, yeah, very different purpose, but yeah.
I think that's kind of where we landed too, that it kind of does knock down the slot model, but in some ways the slot model is a bit extraordinary anyway, so it's not really a big feathering down.
Well, whether it's a straw man or not depends on who you ask. So I think Steve Luck would not say that it's a straw man.
Can I say one thing about the, and I might be speaking out of turn here, regarding the Adam's first question, which is the higher dimensionality and confidence and how you might actually use it. And I think I remember one discussion, Paul, you and I had with Philip, and maybe you guys have moved on since then, but something that stuck in my mind as interesting is if you project the third dimension down onto the disk, you can imagine, like, the idea of confidence is like a set of criteria, different criteria that you fuse to. You can imagine this sort of ring of concentric circles on the 2D dimensions that the third dimension projects down onto. And in that way, you might be able to get like a direct mapping from the speed of that or the drift rate and where it ends up. So not the response boundary, but like sort of intermediate ones along the way. Does that make sense? That's one way that you could like tie that back into confidence as a measurement.
I follow, but I think you kind of draw it to make it
Okay.
make sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can.
I'm not a good illustrator,
But you take your Z plane.
Sort of like
Yeah, so you can take a Z plane
Yeah, let's see.
and wherever it hits, go directly downwards instead of going to the outside of the circle.
Yeah.
And then wherever it hits going vertically down is where your new kind of boundary is. And so that gives you kind of a changing boundary
Yeah, that's.
as you move, which would be a different way of looking at confidence. And yeah, that could be a possible way of doing it.
With that, so just to expand on that a tiny bit, I like the idea of having the different criteria and the different centric rings. One thing we were thinking of to further test this and maybe speak to those things is the idea of the speed, accuracy, response time stuff as well. I think one of this is my dumb idea, was to just try and squish the sphere, but Philip said we can't do that because of model parsimony. Would there be something about sort of drift rate as a function of condition there in the vertical axis, or is that tied to the other axes? So basically, if I understand correctly, if it hits the top here and it's not very far out from the center in XY plane or XZ, then you have low confidence, right? That's sort of a natural thing that comes out of that. But if you did have something where in speed accuracy, at least for two choice, people can be slower, but have higher confidence, for example, in certain manipulations. If, basically the deadline condition or something like that would manipulate the drift rate of the vertical one, and that would, I assume, sort of encourage it to hit those upper boundaries. I don't know if that is anything that, I don't know if you can sort of dissociate that in the model, or if it makes it less parsimonious or something.
That's interesting. We're still developing.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, it might be a bad idea.
No, I think there are no bad ideas. But anyway, I think we might have to stop there because I think there's another group going to get it.
All right.
So thank you everybody for coming. See you later.